You're sitting by the fire 40,000 years ago, and something in the way your partner just glanced away from you, just slightly too fast, just slightly too guilty, has told you everything before a single word gets said. There's no phone to check. There's no text message thread to scroll through at 2 in the morning looking for evidence. But the feeling sitting in your chest right now, that specific, nauseating, gut-level certainty that something is wrong, that somebody has broken something between you, is not a modern invention. It is, by every serious piece of evidence anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists have gathered, one of the oldest, most consistent, most universally documented emotional experiences in the entire history of our species. And what your ancient ancestors actually did about it, the systems they built, the punishments they enforced, and the genuinely strange range of solutions different human societies landed on, tells you something remarkable about exactly how central this problem has always been to human social life. This is going to be a long one, because the honest answer to how did ancient humans handle cheating isn't a single clean story. It's a tangle of biology, evolutionary pressure, wildly different cultural solutions, and some genuinely uncomfortable truths about what infidelity actually threatened in a world with no DNA tests, no birth control, and no way to simply walk away and start over in a city full of strangers. Let's take this apart properly. Let's start with why this problem exists at all, at a level deeper than culture, because the honest starting point here is biology, and it's asymmetric in a way that matters enormously for everything that follows. For a woman throughout almost all of human history, maternity was never in doubt. She experienced pregnancy directly, gave birth to the child, and there was never a single moment of genuine uncertainty about whose child she was raising. For a man, throughout the overwhelming majority of human history, right up until the invention of reliable genetic paternity testing in the 20th century, there was no equivalent certainty available at all. A man investing years of resources, protection, food, and effort into raising a child had absolutely no direct biological way of confirming that child was actually his own genetic offspring, rather than the result of his partner's infidelity with another man. This is sometimes called the paternity uncertainty problem in evolutionary psychology, and it's not a modern cultural anxiety invented by insecure men. It's a structural feature of human reproduction that existed for every single man who ever lived before the genetic testing era. Full stop. No exceptions, regardless of culture, era, or how much he trusted his partner. Evolutionary psychologist David Buss, whose research on jealousy and mating psychology has become some of the most cited work in the entire field, has argued that this asymmetry produced measurably different evolved psychological responses to infidelity in men and women, a claim that's been tested extensively across dozens of different cultures with results that are genuinely striking in their consistency. Buss's research, and considerable follow-up work by other researchers since, has repeatedly found that men, across culture after culture, tend to report greater distress specifically in response to a partner's sexual infidelity, the physical act itself, while women, on average, tend to report greater distress specifically in response to emotional infidelity, a partner falling in love with or emotionally bonding with someone else. The proposed evolutionary logic here is direct and, once you understand the paternity problem, genuinely intuitive. A man's sexual infidelity by his partner directly threatens whether he's investing resources into another man's genetic offspring without knowing it, the single costliest possible reproductive mistake his psychology could make. A woman's partner falling in love with someone else, meanwhile, threatens something different but equally costly across our evolutionary history: the diversion of resources, protection, and long-term investment away from her and her children toward a rival family entirely, regardless of any single sexual encounter. It's important to be honest about the limits and ongoing debate around this research, because it's genuinely contested within the field itself. Critics have pointed out that these differences, while statistically real and repeatedly replicated, tend to be differences in degree and average tendency rather than absolute categorical splits. Plenty of individual men report greater distress over emotional infidelity, and plenty of women report greater distress over sexual infidelity. And some researchers argue cultural learning and social context play a larger role in shaping these specific patterns than a purely evolutionary explanation gives credit for. But the underlying asymmetry, the sheer weight of the paternity uncertainty problem itself as a distinctly male evolutionary pressure that simply had no equivalent for women, is not seriously disputed, and it forms the foundation for understanding why so many ancient and traditional human societies developed such intensely asymmetric, often genuinely brutal responses specifically to female infidelity, responses that, when you look at them without that evolutionary context, can seem to come from nowhere. With that context, they become at least explicable, even when they're also, by any modern standard, deeply unjust. Now let's actually go through what ancient and traditional human societies did about this, because the range here is genuinely wider and more varied than most people assume walking in, and it's worth resisting the urge to flatten this into one simple universal story. Let's start with small-scale hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living approximation we have to how humans likely lived for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence. Because anthropologists studying these societies directly have documented consistently that infidelity was, without exception across every studied culture, treated as a genuinely serious social problem. But the specific response to it varied dramatically depending on the broader social structure of the group in question. Among the Ake of Paraguay, extensively studied by anthropologists including Kim Hill, researchers documented something genuinely fascinating called partible paternity, a cultural belief shared across several South American indigenous groups, that a child could have more than one biological father, with different men each contributing something to the child through multiple sexual partners during pregnancy. Under this belief system, infidelity in the modern sense doesn't map cleanly onto the culture's own framework at all, because multiple paternity wasn't automatically viewed as betrayal. It was sometimes viewed as strategically beneficial for a child, since each acknowledged partial father might feel some degree of obligation to provide meat, protection, or resources to that child later, effectively spreading paternal investment across more than one man. This doesn't mean these societies had no concept of sexual jealousy or no social consequences for undisclosed affairs. They absolutely did. But it demonstrates that even something as seemingly universal and biologically rooted as reactions to infidelity gets filtered dramatically through specific cultural frameworks that can completely reshape what the behavior even means socially. Contrast that with societies practicing intensive pair bonding and paternal investment, where the picture looks considerably harsher and considerably more consistent with the straightforward evolutionary story. Among many traditional agricultural and pastoral societies studied by anthropologists across multiple continents, female infidelity specifically was treated as an extraordinarily serious offense, frequently carrying consequences that ranged from public shaming and social ostracism, mechanisms we've discussed on this channel before in the context of ancient justice systems, all the way up to severe physical punishment and, in some documented traditional legal codes, execution. The ancient legal code of Hammurabi, which we've also discussed on this channel previously in the context of early written law, specifically addressed adultery directly, prescribing that both parties caught in an act of adultery involving a married woman be bound and thrown into the river, a punishment applied, notably, specifically to the woman and her male partner, with no equivalent formal legal punishment specified anywhere in the code for a married man's infidelity with an unmarried woman. That asymmetry isn't an accident or an oversight. It's a direct, explicit legal codification of exactly the paternity uncertainty logic we opened this video with, treating a wife's fidelity as something requiring formal legal protection specifically because of what her infidelity threatened for her husband's lineage, while treating a husband's fidelity as considerably less legally consequential because it carried no equivalent paternity risk for anyone. This asymmetric pattern shows up again and again across an enormous range of independent ancient legal traditions that had no direct contact with each other, which is itself a meaningful piece of evidence. Ancient Roman law under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, established under Emperor Augustus, formally criminalized adultery specifically committed by a married woman, while a married man's sexual relationships outside marriage, provided they weren't with another man's wife, carried dramatically less legal weight and considerably less social stigma. Traditional legal and social codes across large parts of the ancient Near East, ancient China, and numerous other early civilizations independently arrived at broadly similar asymmetric structures, treating female fidelity as a matter of formal legal and social enforcement while treating male fidelity as comparatively unregulated. When completely unconnected civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries with no possibility of copying each other's legal traditions, independently arrive at strikingly similar asymmetric solutions to the same underlying problem. That consistency is itself a strong signal you're looking at a response to something genuinely universal in human social and reproductive life, rather than an arbitrary cultural quirk specific to any one culture. Here's where it gets more complicated, though, and honestly more interesting, because it would be a mistake to conclude that every ancient or traditional society simply landed on brutal punishment of women and let men off the hook entirely. There's meaningful variation even within the general pattern of asymmetric enforcement. Some traditional societies developed formal systems allowing a wronged husband financial compensation from the other man involved rather than violent punishment of anyone, essentially treating infidelity partly as a property or contractual violation resolved through payment rather than physical punishment. Echoing the kind of compensation-based justice we discussed previously in the context of the ancient code of Uarnimu handling other forms of physical harm through monetary restitution rather than direct retaliation. Other societies developed considerably more elaborate social rituals specifically around reconciliation after infidelity was discovered, formal processes for a wronged spouse to be publicly compensated or honored by the community precisely because the humiliation of infidelity was considered a genuine social wound requiring active, deliberate social repair, not just individual punishment of the offending parties. These systems suggest that even within societies that treated infidelity extremely seriously, there was often recognition that public shame itself carried real social costs requiring active management, not just retribution against whoever caused it. There's also a genuinely important piece of this story that tends to get flattened out of the popular version, and it involves female sexuality and female sexual autonomy specifically, an area where anthropologist Sarah HRDY has done some of the most influential and genuinely challenging research in the entire field. HRDY's work, examining primate and human sexual behavior across an enormous range of species and cultures, has pushed back hard against an older, simpler assumption in evolutionary psychology that women were evolutionarily designed primarily for sexual monogamy, while men were evolutionarily designed for promiscuity. HRDY's research instead points to considerable evidence that female sexuality across primates, including humans, often serves multiple overlapping evolutionary functions beyond simple reproduction with a single partner, including using multiple sexual relationships strategically to secure resources, protection, or paternal confusion specifically beneficial to offspring survival in certain social contexts, echoing exactly the partible paternity systems documented among groups like the Ache. This considerably complicates any simple, one-directional story where women were purely passive victims of a system designed entirely around controlling their sexuality for male benefit. In many documented traditional societies, women exercised considerably more strategic sexual agency, even under formally restrictive legal and social codes, than the harsh legal punishments alone might suggest, finding workarounds, discretion strategies, and social alliances that let them navigate restrictive systems in ways that still serve their own reproductive and social interests. Let's talk about jealousy itself directly for a moment, because it's worth understanding this specific emotion as its own evolved psychological system rather than just an unpleasant feeling that happens to show up around infidelity. Researchers studying jealousy across cultures have found it to be a remarkably universal human emotion, present in every documented human society ever studied regardless of that society's specific marriage practices or sexual norms, which is itself meaningful, because it suggests jealousy isn't simply a learned cultural response to specific marriage systems, but something closer to a built-in psychological alarm system, one that evolved specifically to detect and respond to threats against a pair bond and the reproductive investment tied up in it. This connects directly back to something we've discussed before on this channel regarding blushing and involuntary emotional signals, because jealousy appears to function partly as exactly that kind of unfakeable internal alarm, an emotional state that, once triggered, drives behavior, vigilance, mate guarding, aggressive confrontation, in ways that are difficult to simply switch off through rational reflection alone, precisely because it evolved to override calm, rational calculation in favor of urgent, immediate action against a genuine reproductive threat. Mate guarding behavior itself, the active steps a partner takes specifically to prevent infidelity from happening in the first place rather than simply punishing it after the fact, shows up across an enormous range of documented human cultures and takes forms that are genuinely revealing about what people intuitively understood the actual risks to be. Behaviors researchers have documented across multiple cultures include closely monitoring a partner's whereabouts and social contacts, displays of resource investment specifically intended to make a partner feel less inclined to seek resources elsewhere, and in some traditional societies, formal social customs like chaperoning unmarried or married women during specific vulnerable periods, all of which represent proactive attempts to prevent the paternity uncertainty problem from ever becoming a live issue in the first place, rather than waiting to punish it after it had already potentially compromised a lineage. Now here's a detail that genuinely surprises people, and it's worth spending real time on because it complicates the simple picture considerably. Not every documented traditional society treated infidelity with harsh punishment at all, and a meaningful minority developed genuinely permissive or even actively encouraged extramarital sexual relationships under specific structured circumstances. Among certain Inuit communities, anthropologists have documented traditional customs of formal wife exchange or shared sexual access between specific pairs of men in a community, often functioning as a deliberate social and economic alliance-building mechanism. Strengthening cooperative bonds between families in an environment where mutual aid was often literally a matter of survival during resource scarcity or dangerous hunting expeditions. This wasn't secretive infidelity in the sense we've been discussing. It was openly acknowledged, socially sanctioned, and served a specific cooperative function within that particular society's survival strategy, demonstrating that even the intensely serious paternity concerns we've discussed throughout this video could be culturally reorganized and channeled toward cooperative rather than purely punitive ends, when the broader social and economic circumstances made that arrangement genuinely useful for group survival rather than threatening to it. So here's the honest, layered answer to the question we opened with, because after going through all of this, a single clean summary genuinely doesn't do justice to how varied the actual historical and anthropological record is. Underneath all of it sits a genuine, deep, evolutionarily rooted asymmetry, the paternity uncertainty problem that shaped human jealousy, mate guarding behavior, and an enormous range of formal legal and social punishments across cultures that had no contact with each other, producing remarkably consistent asymmetric patterns treating female infidelity as a considerably more formally regulated and often more harshly punished offense than male infidelity, across societies as different as ancient Babylon, ancient Rome, and numerous other independent legal traditions. But layered on top of that consistent underlying pressure, human cultures developed a genuinely wide range of specific solutions, from brutal legal punishment to financial compensation systems, to elaborate formal partible paternity beliefs that reframed multiple paternity as beneficial rather than threatening, to openly sanctioned cooperative wife-sharing arrangements specifically designed to strengthen survival-critical social alliances. The underlying evolutionary pressure was universal. The specific cultural solution humans built on top of it was anything but. There's something worth sitting with here as we finally close this out, because it reframes something a huge number of people carry around privately without ever examining it directly. The specific, visceral, gut-punch feeling of jealousy, the racing thoughts, the need to check, the difficulty simply reasoning your way out of it once it's been triggered, isn't some embarrassing personal weakness or evidence of insecurity unique to you. It's an ancient, deeply inherited alarm system, built by a species that spent the overwhelming majority of its existence with absolutely no way to verify paternity except through trust, social monitoring, and the threat of severe consequence. And it has been running, in some form, in every single human society ever documented, for as long as anyone has bothered to look. You didn't invent that feeling. You inherited it from ancestors who built entire legal systems, entire cultural frameworks, and in some cases entire alternative solutions specifically to answer the same question you're still quietly asking every time that feeling shows up in your own chest. Can I trust this? And for the overwhelming majority of human history, there was never a clean, certain answer available. Just the feeling itself, doing exactly the job it evolved to do.